Hi, everyone. This is Mark Fallon, Senior Naturalist at Briar Nature Center, and welcome to my backyard. Um, we're about to watch a presentation on Keystone species. But first, let me say how much we miss you. We'd really love to be doing this from Briar but hopefully, we'll be back again there soon. And in the meantime, thanks to supporters just like you, our team has been able to continue to produce informative and hopefully entertaining content for all kinds of people. Right now, we're going to learn that in this presentation, nature is incredibly complex. And as we know, in these times, that nature can throw us some real curveballs. But the more we continue to learn about how nature works, hopefully that allows us to get it right the next time. Anyway, I hope you enjoy this, and please feel free to share it far and wide. That is one sort of silver lining of all this is hopefully we can reach a bigger audience and you can send things off to your grandchildren, your grandparents, whoever's stuck at home and would like to learn more about the bigger world. So we're talking today about keystone species. Most people know a keystone is this big stone here in the center of an archway or an arched bridge, like this one in Wissahickon Valley Park nearby. And that big center stone will take the compression of the arch and keep it from just falling apart. So when ecologists talk about keystone species, they are talking about a species, a plant or animal, that has sort of an outsized role in holding an ecosystem together, or at least keeping it healthy. And today, we're going to talk about two examples of keystone species. And for the first, I'm going to take you on a little trip to one of my favorite places in the world, the Greater Yellowstone Ecosystem, or GYE. The GYE is an area of, some ecologists say, up to 30 million acres. Of course, it is surrounding Yellowstone National Park, the first national park created in the world, actually. And it is defined not so much by park boundaries or political boundaries, but by boundaries more of ecology, where certain plants grow, where certain animals live, where certain soil types are predominant. And one of the most incredible things about the Yellowstone ecosystem is it has really been fairly well preserved and managed. Of course, people over the years there have made a lot of mistakes, but it is unbelievable the wildlife that you can see there. I was lucky enough to spend about 3 years living in Jackson, Wyoming, right at the south end of Grand Teton National Park, which is just to the south of Yellowstone. And as a wildlife biologist and tour guide, I took people out every day to try and find these big, charismatic animals like bison. And it was, very much like a North American safari. You could see herds of bison, pronghorn, the fastest mammal in North America. They can run 50 plus miles an hour, and they can keep that speed for up to a mile. Mule deer, which are a little different from our white-tailed deer that we have on the East Coast, although there are white-tail nearby there. Mule deer are much more of a hillside deer. They tend to like to be on very, very steep hillsides, and they jump up and down those hills. There are all kinds of carnivores out there, or omnivores, like this coyote, red foxes, badgers, otters, all kinds of, meat and omnivorous animals. Of course, One of the most famous omnivores in Yellowstone are the bears. We've got grizzly bears and black bears, or brown bears and black bears. And of course, elk. Western elk, there is a very large population of elk in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem, many, many thousands. And wolves. Wolves are a very interesting story in Yellowstone. Some folks know that wolves were actually absent from Yellowstone for close to 100 years. They were extirpated, which is sort of a local extinction. They were extirpated in the early 1900s. And really, the intention of people then was to raise the number of game animals like elk. They thought if you got rid of the predators, then populations of game animals would go up. And they were right. The issue with that form of management is they go up to numbers that are not sustainable. And so we'll talk a little bit about some of the things that happened to the elk population and to their health, as well as the health of the habitat that they were living in when the wolves were absent. So this is what elk love to eat. They are browsers. They really prefer woody vegetation, twigs, leaves, buds over grass. They will eat grass if they have to, but it really has much lower nutrient value. And there is an extreme example of what happens when you have too many elk in one area. Down here, south of Yellowstone, south of Grand Teton National Park, there is the National Elk Refuge. There it is right there. And you can see, you can see it is right up next to the town of Jackson, Wyoming. And there is a reason for that. Here's a picture of the elk refuge, and you can see it's surrounded. These are the Gros Ventre Mountains on one side, and on the other side of this valley, straight behind us, are the Teton Range. And so we're in this high mountain valley. The valley represents really the best winter habitat for any of these large mammals. The lower it is, the less snow there is. So elk, bison, even to some extent mule deer, all come down into these valleys during the winter months. The problem is that that's where people moved as well. Over here, you can see Jackson is right up next to where that elk refuge is. About 100 years ago, that area was one of the last places where people could get free land out in the West. This is one of the policies of our federal government, trying to settle the West and basically, take land over that belonged to Native people by giving away that land to Americans. All they had to do was move there, build a house, build some fences, and it became theirs. So Jackson actually represented one of the last places that people went because it was really a difficult place to live. The growing season is too short to raise anything but cattle, and even cattle are difficult, and you had to be into these valleys in order to get enough hay raised to keep your cattle through the winter. So the cattle and the elk were in direct competition for food. So there are the elk with the Teton Range on the other side of the valley in the background. You'll notice these elk are in lines. This is not normal. If you look at the line in the front, you can see there are tire tracks right through it. they're feeding the elk here. This has been done for, again, almost 100 years. Immediately after people moved to the valley, there began to be conflicts where elk were stealing hay from the piles that were saved for cattle. And when ranchers defended that hay, elk were dying in massive numbers in this valley. So a national campaign was started, and the federal government decided to start feeding the elk during the winter. And what you can see on the elk refuge now, if you're looking down there, you don't see any trees in this valley. No trees at all. There's a few evergreens, pines up on this hillside, this butte here. But even up there, there's very, very few trees if you compare it to the areas surrounding the elk refuge. So all the elk are coming down into this area, and that's where they're feeding the elk during the winter. And what happens is the elk are not just eating the food that people are putting out for them, they're eating all of their natural food as well, all of those woody plants that they would be browsing on. And if you look closer up, there's that butte on the side. There are really no woody plants left at all on the lower part of the elk refuge. So wolves were gone for a very long time. And one of the reasons that ecologists wanted to bring wolves back was to help control the elk population and to hopefully keep the elk population healthy and also keep the food that was available for the elk that were left healthy, all those woody shrubs and trees. And wolves are very effective at killing elk. They hunt in packs. Elk are just about the right size, and they actually do help maintain the health of the population by predominantly going after older, sicker, injured, or young elks. And it's very different from, say, managing a herd by hunting. Human hunters tend to try and find the largest males that are very healthy looking. So, wolves do a better job managing, and they also help to keep those herds healthier. The other thing you can see here is there are other animals benefiting from what wolves are doing, from wolf activity and elk predation. These are all scavengers. You've got the ravens in the background, and right here behind the elk, there's a little magpie there. And there's sort of a pecking order. The elk in the foreground is being eaten by the wolf, but there's little bits and pieces all over here that the scavengers are picking up. This is a graph of the elk population from 1985 to 2010. And you can see after the big Yellowstone fires in 1988, the population did come down pretty quickly, but then immediately rebounded. There was probably a whole host of areas that were burned that recovered in a way that actually allowed elk to exploit those areas better. But then wolves were introduced in 1995, and you can see there's a small resurgence of elk right around the year 2000, but those wolves are very, very effective. And they got the population down around 6,000 to 7,000 elk. And ever since, all the way, if we extended this to 2020, those numbers have remained about between 6,000 and 8,000 elk. So talk about leveling a curve. They've done that for the elk population. Now that's a direct result. Here are some indirect results. Less elk changes to streams and woody plants. You can see this incredible difference over time since the reintroduction of wolves to the woody vegetation, especially in this low-lying area, which is probably a stream bed. So in 2002, you can see there's a lot of open grassy spaces. The willow shrubs, which is what these are eaten almost completely down to the ground. And then in 2015, you've got willow shrubs rebounding to 2 to 4 times their height. The grassy areas have all been filled in. So just an incredible difference. And this difference leads to streams that look more like this rather than the marsh that you saw in the elk refuge, where you've got tall willow shrubs, and those shrubs are creating a huge thicket across the stream bed. And what this does is it slows the water, especially flood waters in the spring. It slows those waters down, and that helps the water to stay more clear. It creates habitat that aquatic animals can live in, especially aquatic insects, which are fish food. It also reduces muddy bottoms and keeps sort of gravelly, clear areas in the water, where many trout species are the 2 different trout species there are spawning. It also creates the perfect habitat for moose. So prior to wolf reintroduction, it was very difficult to find a moose in Yellowstone National Park. A little bit south of there in Grand Teton, the habitat was a little bit better, but moose have increased in numbers since the reintroduction of wolves. So here are some of those effects in a diagram. And even this is a simplification, but it shows you how complex things begin to get. So you have these direct effects of wolves on elk. Of course, wolves are eating elk and reducing their numbers that way. They also have a direct effect on coyotes. They kill coyotes when they're in the wolves' territory. They basically see them as another wolf and don't want them in their territory. They'll do the same thing to wolves that are in a pack territory. So because they see them as a direct competitor, they will kill the wolves. They don't eat them, or they'll kill the coyotes, excuse me. They don't eat them, but they do kill them. So those elk carcasses that are left behind by wolves are picked on by scavengers like vultures, magpies, and ravens. So they're benefiting. Bears benefit hugely from elk carcasses, especially when they wake up in the spring and there are carcasses that have frozen over the winter that the wolves are not able to, get through. The grizzly bears especially have a much stronger bite pressure and can crack bones and tear things that wolves were not able to tear off. Foxes are benefiting from the fact that there are fewer coyotes. So you have the wolves kill coyotes, coyotes kill foxes in their territory as a competitor. Also, the lower number of coyotes means more small mammals, especially within the wolf territories. And wolves tolerate those foxes. They don't see them as a competitor. So foxes are really benefiting and staying more inside those wolf territories. And also lots more rabbits and mice and moles and voles and shrews mean more food for hawks and golden eagles and owls and other raptors. The changes in woody plant vegetation because of the reduced pressure from elk have huge knock-on effects. More berries means more bird food. We talked about how the streams are changing. Those invertebrates are feeding fish. The trout are benefiting not only from better spawning habitat, but more food in the form of aquatic bugs, and clarity of the water makes it easier for them to get that food. More fish are feeding bears and also otters in those rivers. We talked about moose benefiting from the increase in vegetation, especially willow shrubs. And then another aquatic mammal, the beaver, lives out in Yellowstone. So beavers have much more food available to them and habitat available to them. And so that's actually a good segue to the beaver as our next keystone species. But I wanted to leave you in our wolf section. We think of predators as eating things up, but in fact, I love this graphic. The wolf really is carrying that ecosystem in their mouth. It's the act of predation is actually creating a more sustainable ecosystem as a whole. So the beaver, cute, fuzzy, and in many people's minds, extremely destructive. And that's true. They eat trees, they block rivers, they can cause flooding and deforestation. But on the other hand, um, by building these ponds, they are engineering an entire ecosystem. So here's a beaver lodge, and it's a very safe place to be because of these underwater entrances. The problem with this is if the water level gets too high, the lodge gets flooded. If it gets too low in the winter, it can be frozen and beavers can't get in. And if it gets even lower, then predators are able to get inside their lodge. So beavers have to control the water level. They have to be very careful about it. And they do that, of course, by building dams. Those dams provide them also, of course, with access to different areas. If they dam up one part of a creek, that means they can swim over to the trees that are further out and further out. And so those dams tend to begin to, extend out and out and out. Here's an overhead picture of a dam. You can see it goes back behind these trees, the pond over there. It goes all the way out of the frame over on this side. And, those are big, huge spruce trees. They're probably, 80 or 100 feet tall at least. So this is a really large beaver pond here. Excuse me. And of course, these are all animals that beavers are benefiting by creating that pond. Fish have spawning habitat. Fish have slow moving, clear water. And of course, downstream, they have clear water with lots of oxygen from flowing over those dams. And then you've got all these birds that eat fish: eagles, kingfishers, osprey, great blue heron. And then there are animals that use the water to lay their eggs, like salamanders and newts, frogs. We talked about moose and their need for those marshes that are, in this case, created by beavers rather than, just the lack of elk browsing. And of course, there are upland species like this deer that get a nice big watering hole. Now we're going back to those aquatic insects. I don't know if anyone knows who this is. We don't like these little guys living in water. That there is a mosquito larva. And though they bug us, mosquitoes and other aquatic insects that hatch out feed massive, massive numbers of bats and birds. So, bat species like this little brown bat, the black and white warbler, this flycatcher, swallows all eat mosquitoes and other bugs that are hatching out of beaver ponds. They provide habitat for all kinds of plants that would not grow anywhere near that stream. They need this low flow of water, slow water. And those plants provide habitat for animals that rely on them, like this marsh wren will only build its nest out of cattails. So without a cattail marsh, no marsh wrens. Beavers also perform amazing erosion control. services. You can see this Pennsylvania Creek here. This is pretty typical in our area, where the creek has been just scoured down into this narrow, straight stream bed, which is completely dry. That's another common thing with so much impervious surface now, roads, buildings, parking lots. We get all this water flowing into the creek during a rain event, and then no groundwater to fill it in between the rain events. But beavers can make a huge difference. If there was a beaver upstream from this, the water would be, the flooding would be controlled. Therefore, you wouldn't have this scouring of the creek bed, and there would be a constant inflow of water. So obviously, no fish can live in this stream if it keeps going up and down and up and down and up and down and almost drying up sometimes. Whereas that constant, slow addition of water from a beaver pond would make it great fish habitat, would reduce the erosion happening on the sides here because there would be slower water moving through there. You'd get more vegetation able to grow right along the edges, stabilizing the creek even further. Beavers also provide flood control, like any dam. The only thing about their dams is they are a lot cheaper. Uh, as an example, in Washington State, the Department of Ecology in 2003 came up with two different proposals for controlling spring runoff in the Columbia River Basin. One was to spend as much as $10 billion constructing a bunch of dams, and the alternative was to release beavers, to repopulate beavers in about 10,000 miles of suitable habitat. And that they estimated would control about 650 trillion gallons of spring runoff. And I can guarantee that that would not have cost $10 billion to raise enough beavers to repopulate that area. In fact, way back in the 1930s, the US government put beavers to work. So this was not a theoretical proposal. Um, in the 1930s, the US government actually did raise and put to work 600 beavers to stop soil erosion, one of those CCC projects during the Great Depression. Um, as a comparison, in Canada today, trappers, there's a very healthy population up in Canada. Trappers are allowed to trap them there. They get up to about $30 in United States dollars for a beaver pelt. Back then, each beaver cost the US government $5 or $95 in our dollars to raise and release, so about $100 a beaver. But each beaver did work estimated at $300, but that's back in the 1930s, which equals about $5,700 in today's terms. So for a $100 investment, you got over $5,700 work out of a beaver. I really don't know any humans that could make we would get that big of an investment out of, or a payback. So this is a picture of what the fur trade was like. Up until the 1930s, beavers were extensively trapped for their fur. Here's a picture of a fur trapper in his cabin, just covered and covered with probably hundreds and hundreds of different pelts in there. I'm sure some of them are beavers. But it was after the 1930s that people started to realize how important they were to creating a healthy ecosystem. And beavers in the lower 48 were protected in most cases. When Europeans first arrived, there were anywhere from 60 to 400 million beavers. There are some low counters and high counters in the scientific circles, but at least 60 million beavers. And you can see how concentrated trading posts were across North America. Of course, many of them in Canada. but really all over North America, beavers were trapped and traded. However, they've made a huge comeback. Beavers were virtually extirpated or extinct in Pennsylvania, and you can see that in most counties we now have beavers. Right down in Philadelphia, Montgomery County right here, you can see not well established, but this map is a few years old. They're getting well established there. So thanks for listening to our presentation on Keystone species, whether it's the wonderful wolf or the busy little beaver. You know, of course, these animals do create conflicts with people, whether it's wolves and ranchers and hunters, or beavers and homeowners. You know, if you have a beaver in your backyard, you don't want a pond in your basement. And if you're a landowner with trees, you don't want to lose all of your trees and have it turn into a pond, maybe. But on the whole, these are keystone species, and without them, our ecosystems would not be healthy and sustainable. So thanks a lot, and I hope you enjoyed it. Look for more videos to come, and please share them with anyone you like. Thanks again.